Hi, this is Kirby Summers, and I welcome you to my true crime podcast. It is Friday, September 20th, and today's podcast is a follow-up on the one I did yesterday about what's going on with Sean Combs, formerly known as P. Diddy, so on and so forth. I want to thank those of you who took the time to like the podcast. Please do so. It does help the algorithm on this platform. And if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, take a moment and do so now. I have been following a lot of the stuff that's been happening in the Combs case only because it is very similar in nature and frankly overlaps in many ways with the one that I have been working on for over 5 years, which is the case of Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, Leslie Wexner, Leon Black, and I can go on and keep listing names for you, but you've heard those names before. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Usher, a little bit about the three-letter agency that we all know about, a little bit about a certain crime family that intersects and connects to Clive Davis, Jeffrey Epstein, Leslie Wexner, Donald Trump, and of course, to the music industry. I don't even know where to start. So the allegations against Sean Combs are pretty horrific. And the fact that he may have had something to do with the wife. I don't know if he had married her, but apparently the mother of his, I think two of his children, the first two children, this beautiful girl, basically texted her friends saying he got me, and she then suddenly died of pneumonia. In 1985, some of you may be aware that Arthur Shapiro, who was Leslie Wexner's tax attorney and in fact had offices with his partners in Wexner's very large headquarters in Columbus, Ohio, was kind of, execution style. I'm not going to get too, I'm not going to use too many words here. You're going to have to fill in some of the blanks. The day before he was scheduled to appear in court. So the fact that there is a group that we can call the elite. I don't really care what other so-called YouTubers or people who are identified as investigative journalists, but who do not talk about one aspect or the other, say that there is, quote, no Illuminati. Well, there's a strata of the world that we live in who have a lot of money, who have a lot of power, who pull the puppet strings of the politicians, all right, of certain industries, including, of course, the music industry, the fashion industry, the entertainment industry. Why? Because this is the way that cultural conditioning happens. So for people who say, oh, there's no Illuminati, well, then why don't you go back to your mainstream media job and do it there? Because I'm really tired of people negating that we do have bloodline connections, that we have mob connections, that we have intelligence connections, and these are in turn, there is again a group of powerful men who, and maybe there's a woman in there, I don't know. Kamala Harris is not one of them, I can tell you. She is below them. And she follows their orders. I know because I am a former slave to one of these men who run the world. And I was for 8 years. and it is my my eternal rage that a large portion of my life was taken and essentially destroyed, because even though I was able to get away, anything I tried to do was sabotaged. And that is what they will do to a woman or a man who gets away from them and is not murdered. I have had 3 attempts on my life, and I'm still doing this work. I am doing this work so that I can spread awareness of the evil that permeates, sadly, the world we live in, so that the more you know, the safer you can keep yourself, your children, and one day your grandchildren. We know that Usher was mentored, and I'm using the word mentor in like a very broad manner, by Clive Davis, who, as I said in yesterday's podcast, had a 5-year, very intimate, close relationship with Sean Combs. That began when Combs was 23. It went on for 5 years. Davis has said, but only only starting in 2013, that he is bi. However, in his memoir, I believe it's where I read it, he concedes to having had his, quote, first experience in that manner back in the days of Studio 54. Well, who was at Studio 54? Oh, Roy Cohn, Donald Trump, Steve Rubell. Steve Rubell's father was also a mob associate. I mean, the links didn't, they're not, you're not going to be able to like link them together as of today, maybe, but if you have to go back into history to be able to see how they interlap, overlap, how they actually live in the same world, and how essentially it is part of cultural conditioning. Now, the Black music, for example, has influenced white musicians forever. The best example is Elvis Presley, and that was what, in the 1950s. So who was the first person to take advantage of that, right? So we have the Colonel, and there was a big movie made about it recently, showing how he took advantage of Elvis by keeping him drugged. And that is essentially what, let's say, Davis did with Whitney Houston, with Janis Joplin, with Sean Combs, very likely. Justin Bieber is then connected to Usher. In my Substack, and if you're not a member of my Substack, I'm going to urge you to become a member. A lot of articles I have to place behind a paywall because it's the only, it gives me another layer of protection. But every now and then, as I did, I believe yesterday or the day before, I uploaded one on the goings on currently in the case with we're all talking about with Combs. It's free. It's on my Substack. The URL will be in the description box below, as well as my other socials. But I do encourage you to become a member of my Substack. So in my Substack, I wrote about Usher and his connections to Raymond, who was the person who created Victoria's Secret. Now, we know Victoria's Secret from the Leslie Wexner world, right? And I'm going to go into a little bit of what I wrote there. When I was digging into the murder of It's funny because people say, or history says, that Roy Raymond, who, by the way, there's almost nothing about Roy Raymond online, with the exception of the articles that I've been writing. He sort of created Victoria's Secret as his master's thesis while he was attending Stanford. And Leslie Wexner happened to walk in one day, sure, and was able to purchase what was then a six-store semi-empire. If you have six stores, and you're bringing in 6 million a year, which is what he was doing, and you sell your stores to Wexner for $1 million, and then subsequent to that, you find yourself being, flying over the Golden Gate Bridge, and then all your history is sort of scrubbed. Well, Wexner had to have very persuasive abilities. So that I think that what I'm saying is that there have been a long line of people who have been made to disappear, because these men behave like mobsters. Why do they behave like mobsters? Because they have been associated with the three-letter agency. So who has basically turned a blind eye in most of the cases, because there has been some reciprocity, meaning one hand washes the other, right? So they're going to ignore some of the things done by certain people because they get help. So we cannot forget that, well, let's say in Donald Trump's case, the Genovese crime family, which is the same crime family that is connected to Clive Davis and which is connected to Leslie Wexner, uh, in the 1980s and the 1990s, his buildings and his casinos would never have been built without the help of people like Fat Tony Salerno, who was the boss of the Genovese crime family. We also know that when in Columbus, Ohio, when the investigation into the murdered attorney for Les Wexner was happening, uh, and they found a connection to Wexner, that basically that investigation disappeared. It was said about him at the time that, oh, well, we can hypothesize that the Genovese La Rocca crime families might consider Wexner a friend. Now, the time period that Epstein met Wexner has always been changed in the traditional media. Wexner and Epstein have known each other, I think, from even before 1985, because Wexner's attorney was murdered. I believe it was April of 1985, and Jeffrey Epstein was considered a suspect. Moreover, his later partner, Stephen Hoffenberg, tried to make a deal with the feds to get out of jail, offering up information that he had in his safe somewhere, that it was indeed Epstein who orchestrated the so-called hit on Wexner, but the feds did not ever take him up on that offer. That's because, of course, Epstein was a protected individual. Why? Because remember Alexander Acosta, back off, he belongs to intelligence. And then what happens? Alexander Acosta is promoted into a very high level position within Donald Trump's White House. So, I am non-political, all right, meaning I watch politics clearly, but I do not believe in the political system because both sides are corrupt. You just don't see the corrupt side because It's an orchestrated attempt to divide the country, to keep dividing us, then we're not united. And if we were to remain united, we could fight against the, let's say, when Gary Webb was investigating the drug infusion into poor neighborhoods, primarily Black, in California. He discovered that, yes, the crime families in other countries were involved with the three-letter agency into bringing these drugs into the country. For what purpose? Well, that money goes into helping the Black operations, Black ops, that the three-letter agency is undertakes, because clearly they use the money not just for certain things they're not allowed to do in the United States, but they use that money to control other countries. And that money comes in the form of drugs. And who better to drug than poor neighborhoods? Poor neighborhoods, primarily of minorities, because there has been a class war, a race war forever, okay? And it's something that I think people can see, but they don't look at in a historical fashion. So that with Usher, um, when I was doing the work on Raymond, I was very frustrated. There was very little I can find out about him. And so I decided to do a really deep dive, and it takes a long time to do this kind of work. So I urge you to support my work either on my Patreon or on my Substack, or make a one-time contribution. You can do that. I work 24/7 trying to expose the dark side. So, Raymond's family background is never written about. It was really incredibly difficult to find out even who his parents were. However, I discovered that they were also Masons, Freemasons. As with Wexner and his background, I went back into his grandparents' days in Russia, and there were like so many secret societies, among them Freemasonry, that surround Wexner and his circle. I'm just going to leave it at that. Raymond's father is a man by the name of Roy Claude Raymond Sr. He was born in 1919 in Fort Kent, which is a small town in Maine, and he died in 1981 in Connecticut, where he lived with his wife Mildred. Um, and they were actually a well-to-do family, which is why they were able to send their son Roy to the best schools. Now, the wedding of Mildred Larson to Roy Raymond was important enough to warrant an article in a newspaper. It was announced that Roy Raymond Sr., the son of Effie Raymond, was going to get married, and apparently by then his father had died. And Mildred, she was a member of the Daughters of Isabella, and that's a female secret society connected to the Knights of Columbus. And the namesake for this society is Queen Isabella of Spain. So we have the mingling of the royal family and the early settlers of the United States, and again, the continuation of Masonic traditions, all right, in addition to other secret societies, which find themselves into, let's say, somebody like Usher, and I'll explain in a little while why I say that. So, yeah, I mean, the Raymond lineage is fascinating, and Raymond Sr.'s place of birth is a place that was believed to have belonged to the United Kingdom who owned Canada at the time. However, there was a struggle and over this boundary line that separated the British colony of New Brunswick with the United States state of Maine. And then, there was a war, and then the United States won. So, however, if you trace the history of the Raymond family, you find Usher. Usher was born on October 14, 1978. He is a descendant of that family, and therefore he is a cousin of Roy Raymond. Usher's birth name is Usher Raymond IV. His father, Usher Early Raymond III, left the family when Usher was 1, and he died at the age of 52 on January 18, 2008. Usher, I found it's funny because I randomly selected for the article that I wrote on, well, one of the articles that I wrote on my Substack, I selected a random photo of Usher, except he was wearing a really interesting earring. And I realized that the earring had been used by NASA, the space program of the United States, which connects him to the bloodlines, the very important historical bloodlines, and connects him to the whole founding fathers of the United States stuff, and to something like the creation of NASA. And I had done another article about the odd statues and symbols on Jeffrey Epstein's island, and they too connect to NASA. And again, I invite you to come on over and read for yourself, because I provide receipts. So by the time Usher was 13, he was already inside the musical circle run by Clive Davis. Again, a CIA front for the music industry. So like in May of 1973, Davis was fired by CBS Records. It was described as misusing company funds, but was reported to be bribing people who like disc jockeys to play music, which, by the way, is how the music industry operates. So every now and then they'll bust somebody, it'll be in the news, but as we can see with Clive Davis, he was able to, scoot back in. But there was also, at the time, against Davis, allegations of heroin trafficking and prostitution. He had, at the time, and I may have to just change documents here, an assistant whose name was David Winshaw. And Winshaw was really the one who basically took the brunt of the allegations against Clive Davis. Winshaw was, his right-hand man, and Winshaw is the person who dealt with the mob. Now, he dealt with the mob via a person by the name of, just give me some time, Patsy Falcone. Patsy Falcone is all his stuff is also kind of scrubbed from the internet, except for the things that happened, I believe, in 1973 when he was under investigation. But his real name is Pasquale, I don't know how to pronounce it, Falcone, and he is a member of the Genovese crime family. He was connected again to Clive Davis via Davis's right-hand man for, the smuggling of many millions of dollars worth of heroin into the United States from Canada. And so while the government was investigating Falcone, they came across the name of David Winshaw, who again worked at Columbia Records, which was started by CBS. And then they started to look at his activities. And then, of course, it led to Clive Davis. Winshaw began talking, so he became, I guess, somebody who a snitch or whatever, and he named many people. He said that there was more at that time in 1970. It started in 1971, this investigation, that there was more than $250,000 what they called payola system at Columbia to get disc jockeys to push certain records. So it led into discovering crime controlled dummy corporations, plural, and the use of the mafia muscle to keep performers in line. But in addition to the muscle, because they would beat people up, right? You didn't do something right, they would beat you up. But it was easier to control musicians by getting them hooked on substances. So you get somebody hooked on coke, or you get them hooked on heroin, and then if they become too problematic, well, they can just have an overdose, right? We have seen that many times before. We then know that, what, I'm going to tell you who else is related to Usher, because Usher then goes on to take under his wing Justin Bieber. So, but I discovered that Usher is then related not just to the original guy who creates Victoria's Secret, but to some other pretty interesting men who are, quite important. Another man by the name of Henry Jarvis Raymond, who was born in 1820. He died in 1869, and he basically co-founded the Republican Party, a co-founder of the Republican Party, think about that, and a co-founder of the newspaper, the New York Times. Another person that he is related to is a man by the name of Leroy. Those are two words, two names. Raymond, who was born on August 13, 1938, who was the CEO and chairman of ExxonMobil. Now, ExxonMobil, formerly known as the Standard Oil Company, is the largest direct descendant of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. So that we have a Rockefeller connected to Usher, connected to Wexner, connected to Victoria's Secret, connected to Clive Davis, and then, of course, connected to Sean Combs and the depraved world that these men were taught to live under. Okay. Let's see if there's anything that I've forgotten to say here before. Yeah, it's just that I become so look, it's a good opportunity to see what goes on behind closed doors. What we have to remember is that during Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, it was really a sham trial. I personally know that one of the four victims was trafficked to, at least I can off the top of my head, four well-known men, including Donald Trump. But during the trial, the prosecutors didn't talk about that. So when I hear these so-called indie journalists say, well, the four victims that were chosen to come forward against Ghislaine, they were never trafficked. They were just used by Epstein and Ghislaine. Well, that's not true. I mean, they just didn't do their due diligence. Well, they did their due diligence, but it was a sham trial. Sham. I mean, yeah, Ghislaine is in jail, but are her co-conspirators in jail? Are Epstein's co-conspirators in jail? We will see that it takes a lot of people to stay silent and to perpetuate these crimes. Like it's easier to see it with somebody like Sean Combs, who didn't have the training. Although he was with Clive Davis for 5 years, during the time that he was with Clive Davis, he was building his own record label, Bad Boy Records. And he was being, look, I hate to tell you, but a lot of the accolades given to Combs were probably very likely paid for by Davis and or the people around Davis. And I know this because the father of my abuser paid for similar Grammy Awards for his then wife, whose name I'm not going to mention. So this stuff they're not, these large awards are not sometimes, well, I'm going to say are not often given to the people who deserve them, but to the people who are able to bribe the judges, because in the end, money talks. Money talks. We know that then Justin Bieber was put under Usher's wing, and by that time, Usher has become a miniature replica of Sean Combs. This whole thing, this is very tragic because it shows that you can't really get ahead unless you are doing something that is morally corrupt. Not only morally corrupt for you, morally corrupt for your family, for the people in your life. It will shorten your lifespan. It endangers your life. It's a false reality for the public. I mean, I can go on, but I just get more and more upset. So if you look at a photograph of what Justin Bieber looked like as a kid, and by the way, Justin Bieber is the son of a woman who was herself a victim of abuse, the S abuse. Maybe that's why I don't know anything about her. So I begin to wonder if it was so common to her that maybe did she know that her son was being used in that manner when he was a little boy? I don't know. It did become so commonplace, because that's the thing, you get desensitized, and then it's like, oh, well, it happened to me, it'll happen to him, but in the end, he'll have fame and fortune. Well, you know what? Stay away from fame and fortune if that's the price, because you're not going to be able to enjoy it. Moreover, you will become the monster, right? Because if somebody hurts you, you learn that method of living, and then you yourself become the predator. So this is really a story about unmasking the predators that are hiding in our world, who offer people a short sort of ascent to riches, which in the end you don't have anyway. Because right now, when Sean Combs is sitting in jail, he has been stripped of all of his holdings, his homes, all his properties. If you read the legal documents and you read the indictment and you read what's going on, and I don't think in Sean Combs' case, he's going to be able to get away with it. But again, I have to wonder what's going to go on during the trial. Because if Glenn's trial was completely a mockery of the system, and that's not the first mockery that we've seen in a court of law, then are we going to see a mockery of the system? He's not being charged with murder, and we know that there are certain people who have, met their untimely deaths in Combs' life. The same thing can be said in Davis's life. The same thing can be said about other record producers or people, let's say, like Harvey Weinstein. I mean, I don't, or, Wexner or Epstein, we can go on and on with the names and wonder, well, is anybody ever going to like really get justice? So that I think the best we can hope for is exposure. Exposure, which then gives us another peek into this world that most people are unaware of. In any event, I want to thank you for taking a listen. Don't forget to give this a like and subscribe. Thank you, guys.